Audio check. Right, 2 o'clock, let's resume, please. Mr. Hon, re-examination.
Sir, thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon, Professor Anderson.
Good afternoon.
So, you'll recall that at the beginning of your evidence, you were asked a number of questions about the BEI's updated energy projections document and about the carbon budgets. Can I ask you to look at, please, the CCC's progress report, which is CD 9.017. It's the 2020 progress report, June 2020.
Indeed.
And can I ask you, you've got that?
I have indeed, yes.
Can I ask you to look, please, on page 51? You'll see there that the CCC begins by, of course, setting out that there's quite a changed context. So it begins be a new context.
Yes.
And so plainly the pandemic and its impact has had an impact on the way in which various figures play out, and the CCC makes that plain. But I want to ask you about two of the other bullet points below that. Bullet point 1, says that the UK's domestic emissions have fallen consistently since the Climate Change Act was passed and continue to fall, though progress towards future carbon budgets remains off track. Do you see that? And we'll look at the figure in a sec. Then the fourth bullet point says, just making sure I've got my bullet points correct. Talks about the net zero advice and that the target was legislated, which is what you were discussing with my learned friend, and that the net zero objective has been embraced by business and local authorities, which is something that you discussed, and that those were important steps towards the target. And then it says, however, more remains to be done. And then the next bullet point, excuse me.
And the things we're emphasising, it actually says, however, significantly more remains to be done.
Yes. And then this, I'm getting my bullet points confused because I'm getting my pages confused. Then over the page on page 52, we have in the middle, we have a bullet point, the path to achieving net zero emissions by 2050, 1, 2, 3, 4, will require steeper reductions in emissions. Do you see that?
Yes, indeed.
And then do you see what it says under the sub-bullet point about current government projections?
Yes.
So first, just from those bullet points, what do you take?
At the headline level, the government is accepting net zero in the 6th budget report, but that its policy framework or its policy structures and so forth fall significantly short of what is required to actually deliver on the budgets.
And then if you scroll down to figure 1.1, that's where we see the various things plotted, and we see in grey the legislated carbon budgets. We see the black line of what our historical emissions are. We see the indicative path to net zero, that's the 100% target. And we see the government's projections and the reference scenario. So first, the fourth carbon budget, there's been a change from the figures that you looked at, but I want to say something a bit more about that in a sec. In that on this analysis, the blue line seems to be, as far as I can see, just in line with the top of the fourth carbon budget. Do you see that?
Yeah, I do indeed, yes.
And you recall that when you gave your evidence earlier, you mentioned what the CCC had said about the impact of the sixth carbon budget
Yes.
on what we have to do to meet the fourth carbon budget. Can you just explain a bit more about that with relation to this table?
Well, indeed, the significant reductions required for the sixth carbon budget have a knock-on effect for carbon budget 5 and for carbon budget 4, because obviously you've got to be on the right pathway to deliver the huge reductions. And of course, overall, it's got to stay within the total budget that the CCC, or the total pathway rather, that the CCC are prescribing out to 2050.
So in light of what the CCC has said on the sixth carbon budget, what do you take from this table, given the difference between the dotted blue line, the blue one, the dark blue one, and the light blue dotted line? What do you take from whether we're overall on track to meet the fourth carbon budget?
Oh. We're clearly not on track to meet the fourth carbon budget. I mean, that's self-evident from this plot.
Then can we look, please, at the fifth carbon budget? Take first the current position on dark blue line. Even on the way the fifth carbon budget is currently put, i.e. at an 80% reduction, are we on track, the CCC says, to meet the fifth carbon budget?
No, we're not on track even to meet the 80% reduction that informed the fifth carbon budget.
And looking at the other line, are we on track to meet the fifth carbon budget as we have to understand it to achieve the sixth carbon budget?
No, we're falling far short.
Are you aware of anywhere where the CCC has concluded that the United Kingdom is on track to meet the fifth carbon budget?
No, I'm not aware of anywhere where they've suggested that, but repeatedly they've suggested the opposite.
Next set of questions, please. You were asked about whether the government has adopted the balanced net zero pathway, and you said it had not, but you said there were caveats to that, because while it may have not adopted every, well, I won't go into what you said. You said what you said. Has the government rejected the balanced net zero pathway?
No.
Has the government rejected any of the pathways set out by the CCC in its sixth carbon budget?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'm not sure in wider discussion whether the government has done or not, but not within the policy framework that I'm aware of.
Can you please open, and this will be in the proofs of evidence section, the proof of evidence of Sam Hunter-Jones.
Okay.
No, sorry, I'm talking to myself. Which I did have, and then seemed to have managed to lose, so I'll look at it electronically, is what I was mumbling to myself.
I have the supplementary here and the summary. Is it either of those?
No, it is the main proof of evidence, which is ban W31, which should most certainly be on the website.
No, that's not there.
If you don't have it, maybe I can hand it up to you.
Look for it.
It's definitely on the inquiry website.
Yeah, I'm just looking for the ban ones.
find my hard copy. It's not marked. I'll just give it up. It's be over here somewhere. Okay. We'll just hand you up a hard copy if you're finding difficulties.
Just finding
Just the main proof, yeah.
Yeah, I have it now.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well done. So can you go in that document, please, to page 6, paragraph 3.4.
Okay.
And you'll see there that Mr. Hunter-Jones says that the CCC is an independent statutory body established under the Climate Change Act 2008 to monitor and advise on progress towards the 2050 climate target and the setting of carbon budgets. As well as being the leading specialist body in the UK on climate change, the importance of the CCC's advice in the context of planning is confirmed by National Planning Practice Guidance, which expressly refers practitioners to the CCC's advice, and he footnotes there in the planning practice guidance to where that is. Now, assume that Mr. Hunter-Jones is correct about the planning policy guidance and it referring practitioners to the CCC's advice. Even if it is the case that the government has not adopted the CCC's advice, to what extent do you understand the CCC's advice to be relevant to the inquiry?
I think I understand it to be completely relevant. They have to take note of the CCC's advice.
So if it is the case, just imagine the most extreme version. Imagine that all of your evidence was based on the assumption that the whole of the balanced net zero pathway, word for word, had been adopted somewhere by government. And it turns out that it hasn't. In light of what Mr. Hunter-Jones says, to what extent is your evidence still relevant to the inquiry?
My understanding is that it remains completely relevant.
Last questions. You remember that there was a set of questions posited to you about a family going to holiday in Spain.
Yes.
Can you look, please, at document CD 9.124, which is called Elite Status, Global Inequalities in Flying.
Sorry, again, the CD number was?
9.124. Elite status, global inequalities in flying.
No.
Are you there? Sorry, I know the after lunch slump is a bit difficult.
Yeah. 9.124?
Yes.
Yep.
Yep. So if you control F124, you'll find it on the website. It's called Possible, March 2021.
CD 9.124. Why is that not giving me this then?
Oh, make sure you're in the CDs.
I'm in the CDs here. I'm looking at 9.12, 9.012.
Yeah, there's not a zero in the number. It's just 9.124.
Oh.
It's kind of quite close to the bottom of the website. Right down.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I was taking those zeros again. Completely confused by these zeros. Okay, sorry, I apologise for that.
That's all right.
It's the after lunch lull.
Yes. We won't take it as any reflection on your mathematical ability.
Just my technical skills.
All right, so you'll see that document addresses one of the issues that you talked about in terms of inequalities in flying, but focusing on the family holiday to Spain. Can I ask you to look at page 5, please?
Yep.
You'll see about halfway down the author talks about her curiosity about where the aviation passengers, who they were, and what they were doing. And then her second last paragraph says, eventually, I found a survey data set from which it was possible to calculate values for the proportion of all flights taken by people who fly frequently. She was shocked to discover 70% of all flights by UK residents are taken by just 15% of the population. And then she says this, the implications for climate change policy were clear. The politically sacrosanct annual family holiday was not at fault when it came to rapidly rising aviation emissions. Rather, most air travel is down to a small, relatively well-off demographic taking ever more frequent leisure flights. And I recall that you said something like that in your answer. Is there anything else you'd like to say in light of this document?
I mean, just to reiterate, that is something that people involved in the aviation industry and academics around that have been aware for many, many years. That is exactly the case. And the demand is driven by the frequent flyers, not by the occasional flyers going to Spain or wherever else that may be, despite the fact that they are often used as a sort of as a facade for why we mustn't constrain demand for aviation.
Thank you very much, Professor Anderson. Those are my questions, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Anderson. If we can move then as seamlessly as possible to your next witness. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so just while Mr. Asher finishes settling himself, thank you very much indeed for taking Professor Anderson over lunch and after lunch, and apologies for the hiatus that has caused while we switch witnesses. Thank you very much. Mr. Asher, are you settled and happy?
Yes, can you hear me? Yep.
Yes, beautifully. Thank you very much. So, sir, may I introduce Mr. Asher to the inquiry, please? This is Finlay Asher. He is an aerospace engineer with extensive experience working in the aviation industry, with leading industry companies, and on the latest cutting-edge aircraft technology that will emerge over coming decades. He says more about his expertise, which I'm going to ask him about in due course, but just to confirm that he's provided a proof of evidence, appendices, a rebuttal proof, and a supplementary proof. And Mr. Asher, to the best of your knowledge, is all of that still your view, still the evidence you give to the inquiry?
It is, yes.
So you then go on in your paragraph 1.2 to set out how you were employed from 2012 to 2020 by Rolls-Royce designing aircraft engines. And you tell us that you worked as a systems integrator on the Trent 7000 engine. You were structural system design lead on the Trent XWB engine, and you refer to the UltraFan turbofan engine and various other elements on which you worked when you were with Rolls-Royce. And you make the point also that those were collaborations between Rolls-Royce and either Airbus or Boeing. Can you please just tell us in plain terms a little bit more about what all these things are and what it is that you did?
Yeah, sure. So the Trent 7000 engine and the Trent XWB are two of the latest engines that Rolls-Royce have put in service. So they are what we call new product introduction. I've spent some time on the XWB where I was in system design. I was a structural design team lead at system level, where you're exposed to all of the other system design competencies, looking at the main product attributes on those engines and indeed on the aircraft that they are fitted to. I've also worked quite extensively on the UltraFan project. If you understand a bit about aviation, that's a geared turbofan, which is the next generation of turbofan engine. So on a commercial airline type aircraft, conventionally the majority of those engines are direct drive turbofans. The next efficiency gain, sort of step change we can get is from a geared turbofan engine. So in roughly 5 years ago, I was working on the conceptual design of that engine. That was scheduled to go into service in about 2025. I'd predict that we probably won't see it until the 2030s now. Subsequently, and actually most recently, I was also working in future programs. That's where we look at potential future products and out into the 2030s. Again, working with Airbus and Boeing on future aircraft and engine concepts. So I've got a very good understanding of what's possible over the next 2 decades, what the challenges are, and the realities behind sort of what sort of efficiency improvement we can expect to get.
Thank you very much. In your proof of evidence, your supplementary proof, just to finish off this little bit of your expertise, you mention at paragraph 4.15 on page 23.
Yep.
Something that you've just touched on, which is that you were working on the future program and that you chaired the Civil Aerospace Chief Engineer's high spots for almost 2 years. Please, can you tell us what that is?
Sure. So within the civil aerospace business sector at Rolls-Royce, they've got a variety of civil aerospace engines, and each of those has a chief engineer. There's also a chief engineer for the whole of civil aerospace that sits a level above them. I chaired his high spots, which is sort of the key issues every week that pertain across the company. So every week I was privy to those conversations, across the entire existing fleet, across future programs. So yeah, I had a good access to that, a good understanding of that. And yeah, would you like me to also explain? I've got some technical description in there about some of the difficulties around aircraft engines. Would you like me to elaborate on that, or is it?
Not yet.
Okay.
I shall take you to the various bits and pieces. Just to remind you, Mr. Asher, there's just one or two words sometimes that I miss. So remember to keep your voice up.
Okay.
So then back then to your expertise, which you set out at the beginning of your proof of evidence. You tell us that you were the winner of the Royal Aeronautical Society's Row Branch lecture competition with your paper on sustainable aviations. And then as a result of your technical knowledge and your experience, you set up Green Sky Thinking, and you explain a bit about what Green Sky Thinking is. Now, it may be said that, well, since November 2020, essentially you've been an activist against the aviation industry. So you're giving your evidence from that viewpoint. What do you say in response to that?
So I think the most important thing in all of this, the topic of climate change and what a sustainable future looks like for society, is fundamentally information and people understanding things. So that's the main purpose of my channel. I'm sure everyone involved in this inquiry over the past few weeks, there's a lot of very complex matters, there's a lot of misinformation and misconceptions. So my YouTube channel is all about trying to break those down into easily understandable concepts and explanations. In terms of if I'm opposed to the aviation industry, I'd consider myself very much part of the aviation industry. I've still got many friends and colleagues that working actively within the sector. In fact, I've set up a group called Safe Landing specifically for climate-concerned aviation workers that are concerned not just for the environment, but also for the future sustainability of their careers and their employment. We've got to be really careful here that we don't overextend ourselves, blow our carbon budget, and that means we just can't fly at all in the future. So it's really important that employees are aware of this and they're challenging some of the narratives that we see in the leadership of the company, and that's propagated through inquiries like this. So that would be my response to that, if that makes sense.
It does, and of course, where necessary, we'll go in your proof of evidence to where you've cited various peer-reviewed papers as well. So, can we start off then in your evidence, where you tell us a little bit about the overview of sustainable aviation, and then in your section 3, on your page 7, you mention the fact that it's often highlighted that aviation produces only 2 to 3% of global CO2 emissions, or 8% of the UK's CO2 emissions in 2019, and you say that that's not small. Can you just explain in simple terms about that, please?
Yeah, sure. So as I said in my evidence, 2 to 3% of global CO2 would put aviation up there around 7th or 8th biggest emitter in the world. So it's literally bigger than the emissions of the UK, Brazil or Mexico. Then clearly that 3% is a globally average figure. So when you look at the more developed countries, particularly the UK, that have very high per capita aviation emissions, that figure is a lot higher. So in the UK's case, it's currently at 8%. The next thing to point out is the impact of non-CO2 emissions. We've covered that already. The general consensus is about 2 to 4 times greater global warming impact than the effect of the CO2 emissions alone. So for the UK, you'd be looking at more than 10% of UK national emissions. Then you've also got to look at the direction of travel of the industry and also of other sectors in the economy. So the fact that we have a solution, we may not be funding it, but we have the solutions to decarbonise ground transport, domestic heating and various things in industry. The same cannot be said of the aviation sector. So there's lots of projections that look at aviation globally of consuming about a quarter of the remaining carbon budget, so sort of around 25%. That cannot be seen as a small percentage. So I think the 2 to 3% does it injustice.
And just while we're on numbers and significance, can I ask you to look in your rebuttal proof, please, on page 7. Here you're dealing not with the significance of the impact of the whole industry, but with the significance of the impact of this proposed development and its additional emissions. And you address what is said by Mr. Osmond Ireland about incremental increases in emissions from the proposal not being significant, and also the proposal's emissions not being significant in light of the UK's carbon budgets. And again, it's put that it's a tiny percentage of the national or the global total. Anything else that you'd like to say about that?
I think Kevin Anderson put it very well this morning. I put this in my evidence, but I think comparisons are a good thing. So a return flight from Europe to the US generates about the same carbon emissions as the average home in the EU using a gas boiler, heating their home for about a year. So, in one day of flying, you then have to remove a gas boiler for an entire year. So clearly, the more we fly, as already stated by other witnesses, it puts real pressure on having to go so much further in other sectors.
Yes, you use the word there that it's the emissions intensity of flying.
Yeah, it's the emissions intensity, and it's also the energy intensity. So this is true when you look at hydrogen or electric. Those things might be zero operational carbon emissions, but they still use more energy than alternative modes of transport, which in turn drives emissions intensity, because we're nowhere near to decarbonising our energy supply.
A little bit further down, back in your main proof of evidence, please. On pages 8 and 9, you pick up a point that was also made by Professor Anderson, and indeed you refer to more than two sources, but I'm going to ask you about two sources. So the first one you mention on your page 9 is the House of Commons library briefing about the number of flights taken by various parts of the population. And we've already had those numbers, and I'm not going to ask you about them. But we've got here a figure, your figure 2, which is a more up-to-date set of figures, looking in particular at international flights. Can you just talk us through that diagram, please?
You're talking about figure 2?
Yes, figure 2.
So this is a survey of English respondents, isn't it? So in the UK, what you can see is on the left-hand vertical axis, you have proportion of people responding to the survey, and on the right-hand vertical axis, you have number of flights that they say that they take in a year. You can see that approximately 50% of the respondents say they take 0 flights on average. You then got, what's that, roughly...
And that's international flights, we'll be clear. You're clear about that in the chapeau of 3.8.
Yes, that's on the, if you have a look at the x-axis, you can see that's international flights, sorry.
Yeah, no, carry on.
Then you can see that another, I'm going to say that's about 10-15% of people take 1 flight. So about 75% of people are only taking one international flight, and then the final 20% are taking 2 or more flights, right? So hopefully that's, I won't go on throughout all the other ones, but you've got a very small amount of people that are taking 6 or more flights in a given year, but contributing to considerable amount, as about 25% of emissions there.
Thank you. And then finally on, so you then make the point that when you're understanding about emissions and emissions-intense activities, you make this point in your 3.9, that the socio-economic distribution of these emissions is important to understand, given the inequitable impact, and you've made that point. The last thing I want to ask you about in terms of emissions intensity and percentages is in your rebuttal again, please. Actually, you know, your answer before probably dealt with that, so I won't put it again. Okay. Let's move on to efficiency. And that's where you deal in your proof of evidence at section 4 with efficiency gains and the misconceptions about that. And your paragraphs 4.1 and 4.2 explain the claims made about efficiency, and while it's correct that improvements have resulted in emissions reductions per passenger mile flown, that's not the whole picture. And then you give us your figure 3, and indeed other figures on pages 12 and 13, and you explain what the rest of the picture is. So in simple terms, referring to the figures as you want to, just explain a bit about that.
Sure. So there's a common misconception that aviation is decarbonising every year. And this is a bit unintuitive at first, and I think it confuses a lot of people, and indeed engineers working in the sector, who think we're making more efficient engines. Per passenger mile flown, the amount of emissions are decreasing. We're doing a good thing. We're saving carbon emissions. However, what's very clear, if you just look at historical data, is that emissions have been actually increasing, and they've been increasing at an ever more rapid rate. And that is driven by the growth of air traffic. So you can see that on figure 3 and figure 4. Figure 3 shows historic air traffic growth, and figure 4 shows projected air traffic growth. Now that's from Airbus pre-pandemic, but if you have a look at the IATA projections, Boeing's projections, you'll see they expect a rebound from COVID and a return to pre-pandemic growth after maybe the sort of 4 or 5 year dip. So what we can expect from that is we can expect these trends to continue, where growth in air traffic in the UK and particularly globally is outpacing the efficiency improvements that engineers can achieve. Now, the final, actually no, there's a few more points to add there. The efficiency improvements themselves make flying cheaper because we burn less fuel in order to travel the same distance. So there's a rebound effect where air traffic growth accelerates literally because of that factor. There's 2 ways that can happen. One is people might just take an extra flight a year because they've saved 20% on one of the flights. They equally, they might take the same flight, but the flights might fly further away. So you could have flown the same distance and banked an efficiency saving, but now rather than flying to Turkey, you're flying to India. And you've gone a bit further, but you've burned the same amount of emissions. And that's a trend as well as the seating arrangements in the aircraft, propensity to go for more first class, business class seats, where airlines make it higher profit margins, and that also reduces the overall efficiency of the aircraft compared to if it was just all economy seats. So there's lots of other factors there that mean the efficiency savings you're expecting don't materialize in an overall emissions reduction.
You also go on to say in your paragraph 4.6, and you develop this in your rebuttal and indeed in your supplementary evidence, you talk about how it's becoming more difficult to achieve efficiency gains. So in a nutshell, tell us about that.
Yes, so we've had aircraft since about jet engine aircraft since around the Second World War. So sort of 70 years of progress in terms of efficiency on basically the same design, conventional tube and wing aircraft configuration. And there was big efficiency improvements over the first 30 years in particular. So just if I could sort of highlight figure 6 there, and the blue line is air traffic growth, which is accelerating, and the red line is efficiency it's fuel efficiency, which you can see is decreasing, which is a good thing, but the rate of that decrease every year is decelerating. So every year it becomes more and more difficult to achieve the same efficiency improvement that you achieved over subsequent years. So for example, between 2000 and 2015, we might have achieved 15% improvement in engine efficiency, 1% a year. It'll be a lot more difficult up to 2030 to continue that rate of efficiency improvement. And that's something that's not identified very well by the CCC on the Jet Zero consultation.
Yes, let's go actually to your rebuttal, because you pick that up there. In your rebuttal proof, at paragraph 2.4, you address the CCC's assumptions. So let's start off with the CCC's assumptions. And you're doing this in the context of Mr. Osmond Ireland having said that he considers that BAL has assessed a reasonable worst-case scenario. I'm taking all that evidence as read. I'm just going to ask you about this bit of what you say about the CCC. So just expand on why you say that it's not a worst case, or the CCC is being optimistic.
So the CCC use a range of efficiency improvements that I believe go from 1.4 to 2% per annum efficiency improvement. Now that's based on what they see as a historic rate of efficiency improvement, which was about 1.4% continuing into the future. So and actually the 2% would be an acceleration of that, right? And really they've got that 2% number from an ICAO, I'm guessing you know who I mean by that, the UN body for international aviation. They had this aspirational goal of 2%, which they themselves acknowledge they're nowhere near meeting, and they're very much struggling to meet that, and they don't expect to meet that. But it was there as a target rather, as an aspirational goal rather than a commitment that they needed to achieve. So that 2% has been taken by Jet Zero. It's been taken by the CCC as an upper bound, which is possibly fair enough, but you need to understand that that's the case, that that's highly improbable and very, very difficult to achieve. And furthermore, I think it's very important you understand the 1.4% is very difficult to achieve. As I say, I was involved with looking at the UltraFan engine I mentioned. That should have been certified initially in 2025. We were looking for a 25% improvement at best with that engine, struggling to achieve the 25%. So that's 1% a year to 2025. As I mentioned, I don't expect that engine to enter service until 2030s, possibly later than 2030. So there's been delays in research and development, and we're really struggling to get that efficiency improvement because of various limiting factors in the existing configuration of conventional tube and wing aircraft design. So we're very much meeting our limitations, and we're into marginal gains territory where it's becoming harder and harder and more expensive to squeeze the next tiny percentage out of this existing configuration. And we're introducing more and more risk as we do so as well. So does that answer why 1.4 is difficult?
So just to draw that out, and you deal with this both in your rebuttal and indeed in your supplementary proof about risk and the risk aversion within the industry. Can you just say something short about that?
Absolutely, yes. So a lot of what we do in the aviation industry is based on safety first, as it should be, because of the customer perception of safety on board aircraft. There's very rigorous standards, there's very rigorous testing, development and certification that needs to happen before you can put an engine and an aircraft into service. There's also a lot of reliance on past historical designs. There's a lot of working in engineering. If there's a potential safety concern, we rely heavily on the millions or billions of flying hours with current technology to back up the credibility of designs and to help work through safety concerns. So that all contributes to a real reluctance from the main airframers, Airbus and Boeing in particular, taking a big step change to something more radical than the conventional tube and wing design. So yeah, and you've also just got the economic risk, right? So whenever you change something, even if you're making just the engine hotter, higher pressure, higher temperature, and you stray away from your conventional configuration, there's unknown risks associated with that, technical risks that you need to work through. You need to do the rig testing, the development testing, redo the safety testing, and that can cost billions, just in like a relatively small update to the existing configuration, let alone something more radical, like engines positioned somewhere else on the aircraft, a blended wing, body, boundary layer ingestion, concepts that were mentioned the other day.
You deal with the Jet Zero consultations approach to fuel efficiency assumptions in your supplementary proof on page 22, paragraphs 4.10 to 4.21. In a nutshell, what's your point?
So looking at 4.10
to 4.21. So your concerns about the Jet Zero's consultations approach to fuel efficiency. I mean, to help you. So you pick up on the 1.3% from ICAO. Then you talk about what Jet Zero and the evidence and analysis document has set out. That's your paragraph 4.12. Mm-hmm. And the basis, also 4.13.
So I think I can give a quick summary.
Yeah,
and the first thing is scenarios 1 and 2 in the Jet Zero consultation, they don't include the rebound effect. You switch from a 1.5 efficiency improvement assumption in scenario 1 to a 2% efficiency improvement assumption in scenario 2. Now, air traffic remains identical, 466 million in both cases. I identified this to the Jet Zero consultation, and they agreed with me that that was wrong and their models had not accounted for the rebound effect, contrary to what they said in the annex, where they said the rebound effect was modeled. So that's just an example of a slightly misleading set of scenarios. So the next thing is you look at what's possible in the 2040s and you say, well, we might be able to get a 40% efficiency improvement. Let's then divide that efficiency improvement out over the next 40 years. But actually, if you did have this radical step change in new aircraft and engine design, and probably you would be looking at 15 to 20 years to be able to develop that on a very fast time scale, working on it probably a couple of years ago, rapid, large engineering teams, I'd still expect it to be 2040 before something like that could enter one aircraft into service. You've then got the fleet mix, which is, there's 20,000 aircraft out there, and that's just a drop in the ocean in terms of the average efficiency. And because of the 20 to 30 year lifespan of aircraft, you've got a long time before you get any fleet penetration of that new concept for that efficiency improvement from this radical aircraft configuration has any impact whatsoever. That's something you were having a look at the ATA document that supports Jet Zero yesterday and having a look at the most likely optimistic bars, you're looking at the 2045 graph, which I think is a bit misleading. You should really, if anything, be looking at the mid-2030s and ignoring the 2045. So finally, if that makes sense, I also made the point just about the COVID pandemic really hitting the aviation sector in terms of disposable income. Their profits have been completely slashed, so the money available for R&D funding and the resource. I was working at Rolls-Royce. We had a massive headcount reduction. You've seen a lot of our best engineers move to other companies or be seconded onto the Fly Zero Council, which is really just looking at smaller electric and hydrogen aircraft which don't deal with this problem.
Yes, I'm going to ask you about those later.
Okay. But just in general, there's less resource in terms of people and in terms of money to work on these things, which will slow down how quickly we see these things compared to what we might have thought a year ago.
Then finally, BAL's response is, well, in terms of their own modelling of their impact and their assessment of the impact that they're going to have in terms of extra carbon emissions, they say, well, effectively, we've adopted a lower fuel efficiency assumption than even the CCC. I think it's, I don't have my hand on it, I think it's 0.9%. You'll probably know better than I will.
I think the lowest one is 0.8%.
0.8%. Yeah. So what's your response to that?
So I think that's like a relatively likely efficiency improvement, right? I think it's possible. What I wouldn't say is I'd go back to this misconception that will lead to a 0.8% reduction in emissions every year. There's a number of misconceptions. There's just because that technology is there doesn't mean it's being bought by the airlines operating from Bristol Airport. Is it getting any fleet penetration? Are they flying the exact same route, or are they flying slightly further and actually fuel burn is staying the same because of that or even increasing? And is there this rebound effect, which means that, yeah, there's some fuel savings, but there's a few more people, and certainly the growth that we're expecting to see, this 20% increase in passenger numbers, all you're going to do there is you're going to wipe out the savings that you might have got if you kept the airport the same size and you incorporated those aircraft. So I think the key point is that I'd make is, why would the expansion of Bristol Airport lead to an acceleration of the rate of efficiency improvement from the fleet operating from Bristol Airport?
Then next, in your main proof of evidence, you deal with the topics of zero-emission aircraft, you deal with electric flight, and you deal with hydrogen flight, set out in detail in sections 5 and 6. And I'm not going to ask you to go over that because that's taken as read. What I will ask you about is what Mr. Osmond Ireland says in his supplementary proof of evidence, which is on his page 25. Am I right? Maybe it's his rebuttal proof of evidence. Give me one sec. Yes, it's going to be his.
The supplementary proof of evidence.
Maybe it is the supplementary proof of evidence. Apologies. 6.1.2, 6.1.2. I have him saying something terribly important that I want to put to you at a paragraph 6.1.2. It must, yes, it must be his rebuttal, yes.
The rebuttal, yeah, okay.
No, that can't be right.
Just for information, when I click on rebuttal, I get Alexander Melling's.
Great.
Oh,
Well,
sorry, no, I'm on the wrong.
Let me stand back and put to you what I understand he said,
Okay.
and if I get it wrong, I will be told so. What I understand him to have said is that zero-emission aircraft, electric and hydrogen, have not been modelled, and so they haven't necessarily been taken into account in understanding the extent of the impact that will be, it is, yes, it's in the addendum, yes. Yes, it's page 9, para 612. I knew it was somewhere like that. Yes? Ah, thank you. I'm still not finding it. So it's his addendum. Carbon and Climate Change Addendum 1. Yes.
No, it's all right. I've yet to find it myself. So.
Yes. This is a very unfortunate. Yes, it's the addendum 1. Yes, that's what I've got, addendum 1. Yes, is it 6.1.2? Why am I not? Because that's definitely addendum 1. Don't worry that it's not the same.
Yeah.
It is the same document, I think, addendum 1. I don't understand why.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, no, you can't. I'll just have a look online. Anyway, you must have it, Mr. Asher, in the addendum, paragraph 6.1.2. So, Mr. Ozendalen's addendum. Page 25. Yes.
No. Doesn't.
Yes. Yes. Are you there, Mr. Asher? Nope.
Nope.
Okay. I tell you what. I'm going to abandon this point because it's not going to take us very far anyway. It's a point that I can make in submissions. You draw out in your proof of evidence and indeed in your rebuttal about the uncertainties around zero emissions aircraft. I'm not going to ask you any more questions about any of that. What I'll do is I'll move on to sustainable aviation fuels. And if you look in your main proof, please, at page 24, you explain a bit about synthetic fuels, alternative jet or sustainable aviation fuels. And you talk first about biofuels and you then talk about synthetic fuels. So talking first about biofuels, if you look in your proof of evidence, you've got 3 figures, figures 10, figures 11, and figure 12. What would you like to draw out of those for the inquiry about biofuels?
Sure. So when we talk about biofuels, it's important to differentiate between crop-based biofuels, where you're literally growing a crop to make a fuel. Now, we've been doing this in the road transport industry for the best part of 15 to 20 years, right? And we know from experience that this has a detrimental impact on the environment. It's not a positive development. And that's the way that legislation is moving now. We're going to ban the use of palm oil, rapeseed oil, soy, etc., for direct use of fuel. Just in figure 10, you can see that the emissions produced, greenhouse gas emissions, from those crop-based biofuels are even worse than the equivalent fossil fuel that they replace. So then you have to look at what's sometimes called advanced biofuels or second-generation biofuels. Now, on those, it's very important to note that in terms of aviation, there is only currently one commercially viable pathway for advanced biofuels or second-generation biofuels, and that is this HEFA, hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids. So I would just call that HEFA. Now, that is the only pathway that we know with certainty that we can scale. And it's also by far the cheapest pathway. It's still twice the cost of conventional aviation fuel, though. Now, what you'll see is a lot of focus on this fuel in particular. There has to be, because we have very little certainty on any other fuel. They've never been demonstrated at any significant commercial scale, so we can't put really any significant weight on alternative pathways. However, if you then have a look at HEFA and the consequences of it, you realize that it's from waste oil. So this is like animal fat, used cooking oil, etc., where we've been processing another product and we've got some waste oil. The important thing to understand is we already massively utilize such waste oils in the road transport sector. And there's already been a lot of issues with that, notably fraudulent markets with people literally selling palm oil as used cooking oil. We actually don't have that big a supply in the UK, so if you look at where it comes from, we end up importing a lot from China, elsewhere in Southeast Asia. That increases the risk of fraud. It also means it increases the amount of emissions, because we're obviously shipping vast quantities of this used cooking oil that could be used for road transport biodiesel in the country of origin, but it's not because of these distortive policies. So there's a lot of evidence that shows there's been a negative impact of this. It's very difficult to verify the emission savings. But something that's really important is, let's just say that we can be absolutely sure that there's no fraudulent market. We can verify it's definitely used cooking oil. We're already using it in road transport, and only for a small part of road transport. And we know that even with the government's banning electric vehicles sales after 2030, we're not going to ban the sale of internal combustion engines in trucks or in boats until a later date. And we're definitely still going to have combustion engines on the road for the next few decades, and there's going to be a demand there. So if we ramp up the use of this HEFA from waste oil, what we'll see happening is we'll just see a diversion of feedstock from road transport to aviation. And what that will do is it will make the process more inefficient, because it takes more energy to produce it as aviation fuel compared to a road fuel, because of the characteristics required of the fuel. You have to put a greater input for a given output of that fuel. And it's more expensive, which will mean that the government will need to intervene and subsidise fuel producers to switch from road transport to aviation. So what you'll see is an increase in government spending for a reduction in emissions, because we can literally produce less fuel. And that's all basically a distraction, and it's a negative consequence if you're thinking economy-wide. Now, this is the only biofuel that we know we can definitely use in any significant quantity in any reasonable timescale, if you're looking at the carbon budgets that we're talking about.
So just to pause there, you mention, in terms of the negative impacts, you talk a bit about this in connection with Jet Zero, so where the consultation addresses the use of biofuels. And you also, in your evidence, refer to the other consultation, which is ongoing, about sustainable aviation fuels. Can you just touch on that, please?
Sure. So, well, I think if you look at the analysis of how much we could reasonably provide, I've put these numbers in my evidence, but we're looking at best, sort of 2% by 2030 from these waste oils, maybe 5% at most, and then you're topping out and you're using all the waste oil. So it's not scalable past then. So if you look at Jet Zero, they've got projections to 30% or 75%. That would place a reliance on these unproven, untested pathways. The second thing is that the Jet Zero assumes 100% emission savings from such fuels, whereas I've said, actually, for every litre of HEFA you move from road transport to aviation, you're going to increase emissions at an economy-wide level, not have 100% emissions reduction. If you look at the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Mandate consultation, what's being proposed is a 60% emissions saving, I believe, maybe a 70%, but it's certainly not 100% emissions savings, and you can never guarantee 100% emissions savings from anything like this, even if it's synthetic fuel, electrofuels, which we'll get onto in a second. I think I wanted to make a final point there. Oh yeah, this is just the point I made about the reduction in efficiency and the increase in cost. That is stated by the UK government within the SAF mandate consultation. I have quoted that in my supplementary proof of evidence. If you're not sure where, I can find it.
Thank you very much. So you also give us some information about synthetic fuels, but I'll take that as read. I want to move on and ask you some questions about offsetting, ETS and Corsair. Can you take up...
Just before we move on,
yes.
you don't ask me anything about electrofuels?
No.
Okay.
It's all taken as read.
Okay.
So can we move on then to what I hope is Mr. Osland-Ireland's rebuttal. My notes tell me definitely it's page 11. And so it is. Oh, I see. Oh, is that what I'm going on about? Anyway, let's not revisit that. So page 11, paragraph 3.2.3. Paragraph 3.3.2, sorry, under your evidence.
Yep.
Mr. Osland-Ireland takes issue with how you have analysed or set out EU ETS. And you may as well have your proof of evidence at your section 8, your paragraph 8.1 open at the same time. So that's page 34.
Yes.
You set out EU ETS, you set out Corsair, and then you go into detail a bit later on about UK ETS as well. So Mr. Osland-Ireland criticises what you've said about that, EU ETS. What is your response to that?
So I think we're just having a discussion here over whether if you fly in the future from the UK to Europe, whether that will be covered by the Corsair scheme or the ETS scheme. As I understand it, if you went today, that would be covered under the ETS, and that may change next year. For example, it may be that we decide the Corsair scheme applies to all international aviation emissions, so anything that's not domestic, even if you fly to France, it might be covered by the Corsair scheme. I think I'd probably say that's immaterial. I think the issues with offsetting apply to both schemes. The issues with efficacy of the offsetting, with the principle itself, that I outline throughout my evidence apply to both. The only thing about the Corsair scheme is the discussions that were being had yesterday about what's within the Secretary of State's power, or indeed anyone within the UK, is that they have control over the UK ETS to some extent, and obviously not Corsair. We're part of 180 countries in the world, or whatever it is. So it's much more difficult for us to ensure that we have an influence over what the Corsair regulations are.
And just on that, a bit earlier in Mr. Osland-Ireland's rebuttal, page 10, paragraph 3.1.7, Mr. Osland-Ireland quotes from the UK government's consultation on Corsair. And again, we heard about that earlier this morning. I'm not going to ask anything about that. But what I am going to ask you is, from that, do you take it that the current government position is that Corsair is acceptable in terms of its ambition, in terms of how it addresses climate change across all sectors? Because this paragraph does say the UK is also acutely aware of its responsibility to push for greater ambition in tackling climate change across all sectors in relation to what it's going to say with ICAO.
I'm not sure which paragraph are you on?
So paragraph 3.1.7, of Mr. Osmond Ireland's proof,
Yep.
rebuttal proof, sets out or quotes from the government's consultation on Corsia. And it says, I shouldn't have taken this so quickly,
That's okay.
that the UK is negotiating in ICAO for a long-term goal for aviation emissions that, like our national targets under the Climate Change Act, is consistent with the Paris Agreement, and it's aware that it needs to push for greater ambition.
Yep.
Do you understand the government's present position? What's the government's present position about Corsia and whether it achieves what is set out in that paragraph?
My reading of that paragraph is they think that Corsia needs to go further. So they're saying they're actively pushing to change it, so I'd say they weren't happy with the current state. And I just to add to that, like my experience within the industry, I had discussions about the efficacy of Corsia with my colleagues and indeed with the executive leadership team within Rolls-Royce, and they confirmed they equally thought that Corsia was ineffective and wasn't substantial.
Yes, you anticipate exactly the next place I was going to go, so I'll just give the reference. That's your rebuttal proof of evidence, page 11, paragraph 4.8, where you set out your discussions on the industry views or in relation to Corsia.
I think it's just to elaborate on that. When I worked within future programs, when we're looking at these different technologies that might emerge in the 2030s, we do a trade study where we look at fuel burn, we weigh that up against reliability, weight, drag, noise, different parameters. And what's stopping us actually going for that step change in design, taking that risk, would be a higher fuel price. Now, when we're looking at the fuel price and what we're modelling for 2030, we're assuming that it follows the same untaxed, unpriced trajectory. In fact, one of the studies I was involved with, I scoped for Cranfield University, we were assuming carbon tax doesn't come in until 2045. So the industries, within the industry, their baseline understanding is the regulations will stay sufficiently lax. The variation in emissions price and fuel price will be, any policy will be within the noise, the normal fluctuation of fuel price due to other factors, which I think is really important. So that at the moment, these policies do not amount to a large emissions price, and that's not providing the lever for industry to develop the technology that might provide some of the improvements that we're kind of relying on getting within Jet Zero and within the CCC.
Thank you. Final set of questions, please, on Mr. Osmond Ireland's supplementary or additional proof where he talks about decarbonising transport and the Jet Zero consultation. And
So it was this.
So this is definitely in his addendum.
So it's W6/4.
Yes, that's where he talks about the Jet Zero consultation and decarbonising transport. It is /4.
Yep.
Yeah, good. So you'll see in his summary at paragraph 1.1.5 on page 5, at bullet point 3, or sub-point 3, he says all pathways to net zero considered by the UK government anticipate accommodating an increase in passenger numbers of between 58 and 60%, including Bristol Airport at 12 million passengers per annum. And he makes the same point at his paragraph 3.1.7. Can you just take up, please, core document 9.136. That is the evidence document, the Jet Zero evidence document, 9.136.
Yes.
And if you go in that document to A7 on page 22,
Yep.
that explains Jet Zero's, the authors of the Jet Zero consultation's approach. And that says that the modelling scenario that they have used should not, therefore, be seen as a prediction of what DFT thinks will happen with regard to future capacity expansion, but as a reasonable upper bound of possible future airport capacity levels and therefore associated emissions in order to better test the potential of measures to meet net zero. So what do you take from that about what Jet Zero means for the expansion of Bristol Airport that's applied for in this appeal?
So I think that it's just a modelling assumption used within the consultation that's explicitly noted. It's not a view of what the government think will happen in the future. It's not a forecast. It's not express permission for these things to happen. In fact, it's an upper bound, they call it, so like a worst case of emissions to then apply abatement measures to. And equally, the converse of that, a best case lower bound would be constraining capacity.
And later on in Mr. Osand-Ireland's proof on page 12, the same one we're in, his addendum, he says at paragraph 30, well, it's at the top of page 12. I think the number's gone slightly awry. There's little b. The government's clear intent...
31B.
Yes, 31B. 31 doesn't really make sense in... Anyway, it's fine. 31B, that the government's clear intention is to see passenger demand grow, whatever pathway is adopted. What do you say about what the pathways show about the government's intention?
It's a mischaracterization of what the government explicitly said, and it's deliberately misleading.
Then in his summary again at paragraph 1.1.5, at subpoint 4, Mr. Osand-Ireland focuses on the fact that the government does not anticipate the introduction of measures to limit the capacity of UK airports to meet its climate change commitments. And that's also set out in his paragraph 3.16. Can you go please into the Jet Zero consultation, which is CD 9.135. On page 38, please, at paragraph 3.4.1.
.41.
3.41.
Yep.
So you'll see there what is said about influencing customers and the analysis that can achieve the influencing of customers. What is your comment in relation to what Mr. Osand-Ireland says in light of paragraph 3.41? In terms of what the analysis has been that's been assumed?
Well, it's in the government does not anticipate the introduction of measures to limit the capacity. The government themselves say they believe the sector can achieve Jet Zero without the government needing to intervene. It's obviously, they've said, we believe we can do this. I'd challenge a lot of the evidence within Jet Zero. There's a variety of things in my proof, from efficiency improvements, alternative fuels, greenhouse gas removals. I'd also say, I'd highlight the fact that while they talk about directly intervening, they don't rule out basically indirect demand management measures, which is... Yeah, so paragraph 3.44, they do mention that they expect some of the measures could indirectly impact demand for aviation. I think an obvious thing is the cost of all of the measures. You'd imagine that that would have a significant impact on demand. I'd also say that if you constrain capacity, it's a lot easier to achieve what's in Jet Zero. So they are, if they don't directly intervene to limit aviation growth, they will make the various strategies they have more expensive and more difficult. So while they think they might not need to do it on a cost-effective basis, I'd imagine that they probably would.
And you, in fact, address some of this in your supplementary proof of evidence, page 28, paragraph 4.28.
Sorry. Supplementary proof
yes,
paragraph?
Supplementary proof paragraph 4.28 on your page 28, where you look forward to what might come in the consultation responses, due by today, or to what might happen in terms of review that's anticipated within the next 5 years. You give a view about what you think will happen with demand management. So can you say just a little about that?
Yes, I don't think it will be possible to meet the trajectory laid out by the CCC. As we said, that is the absolute minimum required to meet our carbon budgets. It's very likely, I put in my analysis the various optimism that's even in the net zero balance pathway from the CCC. So I imagine we'll have to move faster than that again. If you have a look at the various mitigation approaches given in Jet Zero, principally alternative fuels, which I talked to you about in the next 15 to 20 years, we're really going to struggle to use anything in terms of alternative fuels that will provide an emissions reduction, just partly because we haven't proven it yet, but also because even if we were investing today, it would take time to scale up. The same is true of electrofuels, the same is true of greenhouse gas removal technology. It's not even demonstrated, let alone scaled up. So just timescales are not with us, and all of those things will be made far easier if we constrain air traffic growth. So I'd predict there'll be a lot of responses to the Jet Zero consultation that advise that is the case, and I predict that we will see that happening at a future date, either when the government release their strategy or at a later point this decade.
And final question from the Jet Zero response and from Mr. Osmond Ireland. He makes the point on his page 11 that actually, you've actually answered that question, so I won't worry about asking you about it again. So I'll go on to my final questions for you. Back into your main proof of evidence, please. On your page 46, where you've got to the end of your table that you set out of your responses to the various Bristol Airport documents, including their CCCAP, and then you make the point that the airports, the appellant's proposals, are not consistent with the uptake of sustainable aviation measures because of the impact of the use of smaller aircraft or alternative jet fuels on the way that airports operate. And you, in fact, deal with this in a bit more detail in your supplementary proof of evidence in your section 8 from page 40 onwards. So just in a very brief nutshell, explain what you mean about the fact that the proposals aren't really, well, explain what you mean.
I think a very short answer to this would be that the air traffic growth that's forecast by BAL doesn't include zero emissions aircraft, and I don't think that they say that that will make up in any of their emissions reduction. So we almost don't really need to deal with it. I think if they did, the key thing to understand with electric and hydrogen is the storage, energy storage of those two mediums mean that we can only, you're dealing with very small aircraft, very short ranges, not the standard aircraft that would be flying from Bristol Airport. If they did reconfigure themselves as a future zero emissions aircraft airport, you'd see very substantially different terminals, gates, numbers of passengers at each of the gates, different size and shape of aircraft, different refueling requirements, different charging requirements, different maintenance requirements, and very different numbers of aircraft taking off and landing in a given day. So if you look at some of the electric aircraft that are most advanced, there's sort of Lilium and Aviation Alice, you're less than 10 passengers or less than 5 passengers even, flying less than 500 kilometers. And actually they're looking at really utilizing new small regional runways that are almost like at towns and at smaller locations, rather than utilizing an international airport like Bristol. So I'd give very little weight to electric or hydrogen aircraft. I think BAL have only really included it in the draft CCAP, making a cursory note about them being worked on. So all I'd say is don't let that distract you from the actual environmental impact assessment, where they don't feature.
So finally, just standing back in terms of decarbonising transport and jet zero, in light of what you've told us about electric and hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuels and fuel efficiencies, to what extent do you consider decarbonising transport and jet zero to support the expansion proposal?
I don't. Decarbonising transport just refers to jet zero. Jet zero itself is a consultation. It is yet to close, it is yet to make any conclusions, and I think there's the serious issues of uncertainty, of technological readiness, efficacy in all of the scenarios within jet zero. That's my answer.
So thank you very much. Those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Asher. Do wait there.
Okay, thanks very much. Mr. Humphreys, over to you. Yeah, can we take a brief comfort break, 10 minutes tops?
Mr. Escher. Can we just start with a few introductory questions? I'd just like to understand a little bit about your experience. You tell us in your section 1.1 a little bit about your experience, and you have a very public LinkedIn page which tells us an awful lot more about your experience. I think that certainly tells us that you graduated in 2013, I think, from Edinburgh.
Correct.
And then I think you were on a Rolls-Royce graduate scheme for 2 years.
Yep. The engineering leadership scheme.
Thank you.
It was the engineering leadership scheme, so it's sort of a fast track to leadership development program within the company.
And then, as I understand it, you were and I don't say this disrespectfully, but a relatively junior engineer on the Trent engines. You were looking at high vibration issues in production and on wing, I think it's called.
I was a team lead within the structural system design team within
but
that.
It was a team of 6.
Correct, a team of 6, yeah.
You weren't the sort of design lead at Rolls-Royce or anything like that?
Nope, nobody is design lead at Rolls-Royce.
Your LinkedIn page tells us that you had some involvement with the Vision 20 scheme, the future design scheme. Is that right?
Correct.
But you then left in 2020 to set up Green Sky Thinking.
Yes.
You, in fairness to you, although you on a number of occasions refer to we, you're not here obviously to speak on behalf of Rolls-Royce.
I'm not, no.
And we have got statements from Rolls-Royce. You produced one actually in your Appendix 3, but we also have one as a document called INQ 59 that sets out Rolls-Royce's own views as to the prospect of the types of technologies you've been talking about.
Okay.
And so, of course, I completely understand that you have your view about those things and Rolls-Royce, but if the inspectors want to know Rolls-Royce's views, they should look at those documents. That would be fair, wouldn't it?
Yes.
You do comment in your evidence about significance of effect. You made the comment that Mr. Ossendeilen's consideration of the effect not being significant is vague and subjective. But in fairness, you don't claim to come to this from a sort of environmental impact assessment perspective or experience in that particular field.
No, what I do have experience of is the assumptions used within that assessment, and I can make comment on those.
And Green Sky Thinking is, I'm not very good on these things, I think it's age-related, but is a social media channel, isn't it? It's kind of across several different platforms, would that be the right word?
Yes, primarily it's a YouTube channel, so I've got a series of videos explaining each of the topics we addressed here. And as Ms. Dehone pointed out, in fairness, you are, you're fairly active in your criticism both of government policy and and expansion of airports. Yep, exactly as I've laid out in my evidence. Yep.
And of course, you're perfectly entitled to have those views, and don't criticise that at all. But you don't come to the inquiry as an independent expert. You come to the inquiry as an expert very much with a very public view on expansion wherever it is.
I think Yes, and I think that's probably the case of all witnesses that are coming out.
Now, in the evidence, there are two main points of focus. One relates to the rate of technological change towards decarbonising transport, and the other relates to existing policy measures, which you tell us are too weak and ineffective and so on. And I'm not trying to catch you out on this, but would that be fair? Those two are the two of the principal themes that you want to get across here.
Sure, you might want to separate sort of aircraft technology from fuel processes.
Completely understood, but I was just trying to get sort of general direction of evidence rather than the detail. Obviously, we've got all of the detail. From that, let's just see if we can explore four sort of initial points. As I indicated a few moments ago, you are a very clear and indeed vocal critic of adopted government policy. You think it's wrong and it doesn't go far enough and things of that sort.
Yes, as identified in my evidence, as confirmed by other people working in the industry. Yep.
And to that extent, you seek to bring about change in government policy.
Yep, I think that's fair. As I've laid out, I think the government policy isn't currently sufficient to achieve decarbonisation in the relevant timescales. I think a logical conclusion of that is that government policy needs to change.
Correct. Second point, so there are these four, and we'll come on to other things, but second point, you are also critical of the CCC and its analysis, particularly the analysis in the balanced pathway, which you again feel is wrong or not a good yardstick, I think you say at one point.
Yeah, I think the CCC's various pathways need to be viewed in context of what they are, and that is, I think, various different assessments of what could happen with technology. And my comment would be that the net zero balance pathway has optimistic assumptions in there on a number of levels.
And I mean, you kind of very neatly, cleverly segued into the next point I was going to ask you. In a sense, the Jet Zero consultation reflects that, doesn't it? I think at one point it uses the expression, I'd have to look up precisely what it is, but it's something like one goal, multiple pathways or something like that. You want to check it, but it's I think it's clear target, multiple options along those lines. Clear goal, multiple solutions.
Yeah,
check my note.
One of the solutions it's missing is capacity constraints or demand constraints.
Yes. And we can see from that, and it's clear, isn't it, also from decarbonising transport, and in a sense this is reflected in the Jet Zero consultation, that there may be multiple solutions. So one goal, clear goal, multiple solutions. There may be multiple solutions, and indeed I think also that those may change over time. So I don't think decarbonising transport, or indeed the consultation paper, claim to set out this is it, this is what we have to do. It's recognised that there are multiple solutions, they will change over time, and that that is itself part of policy.
What is the question? Because it's a consultation, so they are
Yeah.
putting forward illustrative pathways.
I think it's a good point. I think the question is that is itself part of the strategy, isn't it? That government is not here looking for a single solution. CCC had multiple pathways. Jet Zero consultation has multiple scenarios. Government itself, in decarbonising transport, says a clear goal. In Jet Zero consultation says a clear goal, multiple solutions. That we're expecting, aren't we, things to change over time?
As with absolutely anything, things will definitely change over time. I'd say what it's doing, what it fails to do, just to give an aerospace analogy, if you're a pilot and you've got multiple directions of action, you have a look at all of those scenarios, you weigh up the risks of each of them, and you give yourself a plan B if you think that there's a high chance of failure with any of those. So I'd look at each of the measures, and I've done that in detail, used in Jet Zero, and I see serious risks and uncertainties, serious uncertainties with delivering, but even if we deliver, serious risks of implementation, particularly around alternative fuels and particularly around greenhouse gas removals.
Now, you've been through both your supplementary evidence and because the supplementary was specifically dealing with decarbonising transport and the Jet Zero consultation. So both in that proof of evidence and indeed elsewhere on your social media platforms, critical of the Jet Zero consultation, but I don't know whether you've taken the opportunity, but you will have an opportunity until 11:45 tonight anyway, to make those representations to government.
Yeah, and I will be doing so as part of this group called Safe Landing.
I'll try not to keep you going here too long.
A group of pilots and engineers, and we're very concerned about the lack of credible pathway within Jet Zero, and we'll be identifying to the government that's the case. We're worried particularly about jobs in the sector and what it means if there's a sudden contraction because we expand
Yes.
out with our means.
But obviously the way in which the process works is that government will take into account your consultation response and the others in the group that you've identified, and obviously the views of others, many others, and we've identified some of them before in relation to the Jet Zero Council or Sustainable Aviation, and will ultimately come to a policy position. But that's not the function of this inquiry, is it?
No, that's just a consultation. I don't think we can put any weight
sorry,
on.
I perhaps didn't put that well. It's not the function of this planning inquiry to predict or prejudge the outcome of that process. Here we're dealing with an application to extend some buildings, build some car parking, a road, and change some planning conditions. We're not here debating future.
I understand that, and I would not advise the inspectors give any weight to Jet Zero consultation in its current form. And I think the only issue with it is it serves as a distraction from the substantive issues at hand.
It's obviously not. The airport's case wasn't built reliant on the Jet Zero consultation, was it? Because it postdated all of our evidence. Our evidence was based on other things.
Yes, self-evidently, yep.
The fourth of these things I wanted to just touch on with you. You talk at one point about emissions reductions claimed by or relied on by the airport. I think there, are you talking about are you talking about are you talking about the carbon budgets and the net zero target? Is that what you mean?
You've got a series of abatement measures, right? So you talk about efficiency improvement. You talk about biofuels or alternative fuels.
I see. I mean, certainly in our forecasts, and it's the point I think that Mr. Hone was putting to you in Mr. Ozeneilen's addendum document, and I think literally a few moments ago I've worked out where the problem was with the paragraph 6.1.2. I think what she was referring to was the addendum, Mr. Ozeneilen's addendum 1 itself has an appendix A.
So I think it's easier if you say W6/, is it W6/4?
That is a very good question. I have absolutely
should
no
be
idea.
BAL
W20? Does that make any sense? If you look on the website, there's something that says proof of evidence, climate change, addendum 1, or addendum 1 and appendix. It's the appendix that I think Mr. Hone was.
I think it will work if you read it out. And yeah.
I'll read it. I'll read it out. What it said was in
Sorry, which paragraph in the?
612. I think, as I say, I only just worked this out. The paragraph that was being referred to and was in the appendix to that document. But you covered the point more generally. It says, in the context of the appeal proposal, it's important to point out that the forecasts do not assume any take-up of zero-emissions aircraft prior to Bristol Airport reaching 12 mppa. All the aircraft types are assumed to be already in operation. This can be seen in the fleet mix. And it was a point you touched on right at the end of your evidence in chief. Do you remember when you said, well, an airport would have to therefore accommodate hydrogen aircraft and things of that sort, and that's not been assumed? Do you remember?
Yeah, around zero-emissions aircraft.
Yes.
Yes.
And the point I wanted to just there clarify with you, which I think you'll be able to agree with, is that when the inspectors look at the forecast emissions from the proposed development, they look at that sort of forecast. You remember I touched on it with Professor Anderson in his figure 1 and what the numbers are, and we'll put to one side what the percentage is, but whatever the numbers are, those numbers have not assumed all of these zero-emission aircraft types and things of that sort. That would be a further reduction on those numbers.
Not necessarily, not if it's not replacing. There might be additional aircraft in addition to the growth that we might go through with this. We might have this planning permission granted. We might increase passenger numbers.
Isn't it implicit if we've forecast the number of aircraft to get to 12 million and we're capped at 12 million, and then over time new aircraft types come in, hydrogen and electric and so on, that those aircraft, of course, insofar as they replace aircraft, but they would have to because there's a cap on passengers, that the emissions numbers in the environmental statement addendum, in fact, will be lower than we've forecast. I think it's the point you were making.
The point I've made is to not put any weight on electric and hydrogen aircraft because they're not developed yet. You could have put forward a proposal that includes zero-emissions aircraft and an infrastructure proposal that caters to those aircraft, but it's not my understanding that you have.
No, we've not assumed, in the forecasts of emissions, we've not assumed zero-emission aircraft. All right. Fine. Then let's move on. And again, as with Professor Anderson, I'm not going to go over points that I've put to other witnesses, and again, I hope you'll accept that doesn't mean I agree with them, but I'm trying to move things on and not duplicate. So I'll pass over some things about the regulatory context, but I just wanted to touch on one of them in relation to the UK ETS, and it touches on really your point to do with efficiency and growth of carbon and so on. The way that the ETS system works, and I did go through this with Dr. Hinnells, is, yes, there is a price mechanism, but there's something slightly more fundamental than the price of carbon mechanism, and that is the number of allowances that every aircraft operator at the end of the year has to have monitored its actual emissions, and it then has to submit the right number of allowances to cover that. And if it doesn't, it gets penalised the following year. Now, whether it's...
Of course, we're aware that there's currently a large pool of allowances, which has made them incredibly cheap, and there's lots of exemptions to UK airlines.
Of course. And that's why, and again, we covered this, obviously it's going to be for government who are operating the system to decide which allowances, but are we able to agree, because there will be no emission of a ton of carbon within the UTS system without an allowance being submitted, that the government has the ability to control those emissions?
Well, the first thing is I probably don't think I'm the best person to comment on that.
Fine.
But I would make the singular point that even if the emissions trading system did apply to all emissions, and even if every single emission produced within the UK was offset, I've stated in my evidence that 85% of those offset schemes have proven to be ineffective at reducing emissions. So we might go ahead and apply offsets to them, we might pay for them whatever price there is.
Yes.
But demonstrably the principle of offsetting has been proven to be ineffective and difficult to verify.
Yes, I wasn't sort of touching on offsetting. I was actually talking about the actual allowances. When you say, look, at the end of the year I've had so many tons, I have to now give you, administrator, I think it's going to be the Environment Agency, I have to give you now the number of allowances. That gives the ability to control. But if that's not for you, then...
You can buy more allowances,
Of course
right?
you can.
So
but you've got to buy them from the pool, and the pool is capped.
It does. I don't think that will mean that emissions from Bristol Airport won't continue to go up. We've shown there's a lot of demand elasticity around flying. It may just be that passengers are willing to pay more money, pay for the higher offsets, increase the
put
cost
aside offsets, just an allowance. You just have to... Now, an airline could decide to fly from Bristol, or it could decide to fly from somewhere else, but at the end of the year, within the UK, it will have to submit its allowances.
and it can buy further.
Of course, it could buy further allowances from others, but then they would have to emit less. I just wanted to see if you can't deal with this. I understand, I'm not going to press you, but it just seemed to me that that was a point that perhaps should give some confidence with your concern about efficiency and everything else, that ultimately this is capped.
I think within my, I admit, limited understanding of this, I think the main consideration for the inspectors is if that happens and if the airport passengers continue to pay more and more, does that put real costs onto the rest of the constituents within the UK, and will it make their lifestyles more expensive? When we're talking about a large socioeconomic distribution of people who drive cars, who heat their homes, who are going to struggle to decarbonise, is that going to be impacted by this happening? As I say,
the other people with permits are people like energy operators, generating stations. I mean, they're not forced to sell permits. They don't have to. They will have their own allowances. They will sell if they want to, if they have managed to create they've decarbonised sufficient, they've got more allowances than they need.
And we will potentially offset the good work we've done there by just increasing emissions from Bristol Airport, and we'll be back at ground zero. Offsetting works both ways, doesn't it? We could make really good progress somewhere and then undo it all by an expansion in aviation.
You made a point, I think by reference to your figure 2, and again, apologies for sort of kind of darting around a little bit. It's a consequence of trying to pick up some of your points. But in your figure 2, that's you're dealing with a point on page 8 and 9, and it's the point that's been made in a number of different forms, and a number of different people, about a relatively small proportion of people being responsible for a relatively large proportion of flights. Put aside what the precise numbers are, that
1% of the global population responsible for 50% of global CO2 emissions.
And obviously, I say different numbers, different things. That's global. Numbers in the UK are different. But if we look at the characteristics of Bristol Airport, Bristol Airport is a regional airport, isn't it? It serves principally its regional area, southwest, to some extent South Wales.
I can't comment on that.
Okay. I think you probably do know, because Mr. Ossendeiland makes the point that it's very largely a short-haul airport. I think 90% of flights are within the EEA, European Economic Area.
Again, I can't confirm or deny that number, but I'll take that as. I think we went over that yesterday, so I'll assume that's correct.
I'm not. Make an assumption. I'm not going to kind of hold you to it. We know again from other parts of the inquiry that when you look at the profile of airlines, they're predominantly budget airlines. We've had all sorts of debate about low-cost parking and things like this. Insofar as 1% of the population globally take 50% of flights, or whatever the equivalent proportion is, I think it might be 15% of people in the UK, 70% of flights. Bristol Airport is not exactly, I hope they'll forgive me for saying this, but the airport for high rollers with people taking long-haul flights all over the world, multiple trips. It is predominantly a regional, short-haul, low-cost airport.
I wouldn't say those two things follow. I wouldn't have thought they would have followed. I would have thought that if you looked at the average customer using Bristol Airport, they would be above the average income than the average person that you might just get on the street. I feel like that fact isn't correct, but I can't challenge it.
Okay. Let's. So we're now at 4 o'clock. I haven't obviously finished. Would you like to go on for a little bit?
Roughly how long?
I think I said originally 45 minutes. I think I've been going for just under or about half an hour. That forecast is probably not that far wrong, so another 15, 20 minutes.
At the moment, Mr. Hon, do you think you've got much re-examination?
At the moment, 10 minutes.
Sorry?
Have I doomed Mr. Asher to a night by himself?
Don't answer that.
I was going to say.
No, don't take that the wrong way.
I was going to say it seems a missed opportunity if you're questioning me on policy rather than technology. So I was going to ask if you've got more questions on policy. We could answer quickly on those.
Okay. Well, maybe.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Let's progress. See if we can possibly make it. I'm conscious that we need to be out very smartish at 4:30-ish. So yeah, let's carry on.
Okay, and I'll ask some questions on policy as you've suggested, and then
I was suggesting I'm probably not the best person to ask.
Not
policy.
the best person. I do apologise. I didn't hear that.
I'm happy to
correctly.
add my opinion, but I'm more of an expert on technology. That I'm an engineer, so if there's any concerns around abatement measures and their technical efficacy.
Okay, so on that basis, I won't ask you questions on policy. I've asked other people some things about that. Let's then just talk about technology I suppose in the context of the Jet Zero consultation, but bearing in mind it is a consultation document. You have, as we agreed earlier, obviously been very critical of the Jet Zero consultation. Clearly many other organizations, though, including some of those referred to in the Jet Zero consultation, so the Jet Zero Council and others, clearly take a different view from yours.
I don't think they would if you went and talked to. I've spent a lot of time talking to different engineers in different companies, and I've never had disagreement on a lot of the evidence that I've presented here.
If we talk, for example, if one looks at the documents we have from Sustainable Aviation, or some of the views of the Jet Zero Council, or yesterday I asked Dr. Hinnells about Ricardo and some of their conclusions on SAFs or some of the Rolls-Royce publications, they're clearly more optimistic, aren't they, about the prospects of these different both fuels and technologies than perhaps I judge that you are.
I disagree with that. I think they're saying this is what's possible, and they're also in the same document saying, please also give us hundreds of millions of funding to ensure we can do this. In terms of alternative fuels, we're talking about tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions per year in the mid-2030s. That's an ICAO projection for these fuel facilities. Yeah. So they don't think they can do it by themselves, actually, without government intervention.
No, but one of the things we do know from the various announcements around the time of decarbonising transport and the Jet Zero consultation is that the government have announced some absolutely massive investments in the sector. I think, is it 1.9 billion was one of the announcements?
I'm not sure which figure you're referring to, but that sounds like a normal investment the government would put into the aerospace sector in a given year. Yes. Rolls-Royce alone is about $1 billion in R&D every year.
Yeah, so, I mean, huge sums of money being
which amounts to business as usual.
Devoted to this.
And just on the alternative fuel side, the industry asked for £500 million investment for alternative fuels facilities. The government have given them 15 at the moment, just to do a study. So that's kind of the disparity between the industry ask and the government provision.
Of course, but the economic opportunities of SAF, as indeed the Ricardo report that we looked at yesterday points out, are absolutely massive.
Only if you export fuel in greater quantities to other countries and make export revenues. Now, if alternative fuels have a negative environmental effect, as I've put in my evidence I believe they do, that will require us to export an environmentally damaging product in order to make back our investment. It actually puts us at serious risk of stranded assets, loss of public and private finance.
Yes, but Mr. Asher, as I come back before, we're dealing here with a local planning inquiry into some relatively modest buildings, small increase in capacity by
2 million passengers.
Tiny.
2 million passengers is small.
Well, out of the hundreds of millions in the UK, and obviously, the inspectors are not going to be able to determine, are they, the direction of all fuel and technology changes over the next 30 years? That's just not their function, is it?
Well, I think I've laid out quite well in my evidence why, particularly in the next 15 years, we can't rely on any technology, whether that's aircraft technology, fuel production process, greenhouse gas removal. And this is the critical period, right? So I think we can be pretty certain it's quite an easy story. We need demand management, we need capacity constraints.
Yes. But as I discussed with Professor Anderson, even assuming the CCC's balanced pathway is ultimately the pathway that happens, and I know you've been critical of that, this particular proposal is still a tiny fraction of 1% of what is required to get to net zero in 2050. It's absolutely tiny. And if the test, as Dr. Hinnells has said, is one of whether this makes a material difference to the government's ability to meet its climate change targets, the answer is clearly no.
I think the answer is clearly yes, because the abatement measures will put the cost of overall emissions reductions up across the rest of the economy, and that will have a material impact on members of the UK public that don't even fly.
So you say it would have that effect. I haven't seen any substantive evidence from
I
you
talked
on
about
that.
Alternative fuels. I talked about the fact that we will, if we scale those up, as Bristol Airport is suggesting is one of its primary abatement measures, that will simply divert feedstock from road transport to aviation. That will put the cost of driving, it will put the cost of shipping up, food prices.
Those costs
that's quite a significant impact. To the
are
average person.
implicit in the costs of the ETS. Carbon prices are included. I was going to say implicit, they're explicit. They are included in the modelling. And if the carbon price went up, then you would get what we've called slower growth. But that was dealt with in the earlier topics. We know about that. It's consistent with the forecasts.
I disagree with that. And I think we need to remember, if we put the carbon price up, that will have an impact to people with a gas boiler, as I said. If you're looking at fuel prices this winter, there's lots of people that are worrying about being able to pay their bills, particularly people in fuel poverty.
Okay.
And if you use that measure, you'll have an impact on them.
Final point, I suppose, which I think I have put to other witnesses, so forgive me, but for all the debate on the policy response to meeting net zero for aviation, government has not indicated that capacity caps at airports is an appropriate part of its potential menu of policy responses.
I don't believe it used the word appropriate. I think they said they believe they won't need to do it. And I've obviously responded to that
in relation
consultation.
to demand. Demand is a different issue, and demand, they have said, could be influenced by the carbon price in the ETS. I'm talking about capacity.
Yep. So as I say, I think we've already seen evidence that shows those two things are intertwined. We've also seen within the Jet Zero consultation itself that they attempt to use, that they model different carbon prices, and it doesn't have a particularly significant impact on demand. So the mechanisms you're talking about, it's actually quite difficult to cause a change in demand using the mechanisms that the government currently have at their disposal. So unless we change those mechanisms, I think the only option available to us right now is capacity constraints. There is, I think, a straight carbon price. We'll have that issue, and that's why lots of people talk about the frequent flyer levy. That's one of the options I've proposed in my response. But until we have something like that at our disposal, capacity constraints, I think
would that
option.
require a change of policy?
I think we can decide at a local level to reject this application, and that would be a capacity constraint.
If
consistent with policy as it stands.
would it require because you're not just talking about Bristol, your views are, as are well known from the platform, are nationally. Would that require a change of policy?
As I understand it, I think every this decision is delegated down to local level, and at every local level they can decide to block airport expansion. So as I understand it, it's perfectly possible within current policy.
Of course, the inspectors could refuse planning permission on all sorts of grounds. I know, highways, impact on greenbelt. I mean, all sorts of things. Of course, they can do that. I
So
was
within
just
current policy, it's
interested
possible.
Uh,
whether.
Sorry, can I interrupt? I don't actually know who it was, but can we please stay quiet when we're holding the inquiry? It's very distracting, and I completely lost what the question and answer was. Mr. Humphreys, could you have a go at that again, please?
Yes, of course. We were talking about, you were talking about the various responses that came out of the Jet Zero consultation. I put to you that it's nowhere part of that the government is looking to cap capacity, and you then sort of explained how that was needed. And I was asking whether that would require a change in policy.
So my response on Jet Zero was that I've responded to that consultation, indicating I think that we will need that measure, and that the government should do that from the top down, because it would be great if the government did that in an organised way at national level. That isn't happening, and as I understand it, current policy, we're perfectly capable of making the decision to block the airport on logical grounds without a change of policy being required.
Mr. Asher, your position is very clear, but thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Mr. Hon, you got any re-examination?
Yes, sir, thank you very much indeed, and I think we should be fine for time.
Okay.
Mr. Asher, first, a series of questions were put to you to bring out that really you were relatively junior in your role with Rolls-Royce, with, I think, the implication that some of the things you talk about in your evidence may have been a bit beyond your personal experience. I did ask you some questions about your interaction with the chief engineers and with the futures body that you were part of. Can you just explain your interaction with the sort of higher-ups, if I can put it broadly, in Rolls-Royce, and what you took from that?
Sure. I mean, I've already described I was on the engineering leadership scheme, which is an accelerated program that gave me exposure at an early stage to key engineering leaders in the organization. I was also, because I was within system design, and I was a team lead within system design, within most aerospace companies, you have sort of component engineers, subsystem and system, and the system people have the overview of the complete engine. We were always having to balance attributes, so you understand and develop that understanding of all sorts of issues around the engine, challenges and constraints that we have. So I gained that experience as an integrator on both new product introduction engines, and I spent a large part of my career looking at these future technologies, working with chiefs of technology that understand the technology roadmaps for a series of technologies, whether that's carbon fiber structures, hotter, higher pressure turbines, ceramic matrix composites, carbon fiber fan blades, variable pitch fan, any technology that you discuss and you want to ask me about, I can answer about. So I've had increasing leadership roles, and I've been involved directly with the sorts of technology that's being discussed within Jet Zero and is being relied upon for efficiency improvements. In terms of interactions with the executive leadership team, I've discussed, I've had conversations with the chief executive officer, the chief technology officer. I've attended presentations and asked questions. I've had one-on-one meetings. I've had lots of emails, conversations. When I was still in the company, I formed an employee sustainability group that looked at the company's sustainability strategy We met in regular weekly meetings where we discussed a lot of the technology identified here, came to a conclusion on it, and asked the corporate sustainability team for their input, and asked them very pointed, direct questions, bottoming out some of these very difficult issues that are difficult for people to work through, developing my understanding on exactly what was required. So I feel like I come from this with a base of broad knowledge, industry insider knowledge, and I've put the views in my evidence to people right at the top of the company.
You were asked about INQ 59, the Rolls-Royce document, which I think was the document introduced earlier this week, which I think you've seen. Just to be absolutely sure, it's on the inquiry website under the tab for documents submitted during the inquiry. And if you look at INQ 59, that's the Rolls-Royce document.
Yep.
What, if anything, is your comment on that document? Well, first of all, have you seen it? I
have seen it, yes.
Yes.
Yep.
What's your comment on it?
Well, it lays out a very similar trajectory. I mean, I can point you to... It relies on they have on page 20 figure... There's a figure on the bottom left of page 20 that has emissions pathways. They're assuming fuel efficiency improvements, sustainable fuels. So it's really it's identical, and if anything, you'll see this, the Jet Zero consultation and the industry bodies, they inform each other and they have very similar messaging. I think the thing that I'll point your attention to is if you look at pre-2030, you'll see that emissions are rising from about 200 megatons of emissions today to 300 or so emissions, and abatement measures are barely coming in at that point. And we've got a decade to act on climate change. So the emissions are rising. And I think I'd view that figure, if you go to what I think is a really interesting quote in this paper from Warren East, the chief executive of Rolls-Royce. Let me just find this because Yeah, so if you go to page 5, there's 3 columns. In the middle column, I'll just read out it says specifically, to quote exactly, the longer carbon emissions rise, the more painful and disruptive the transition. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. We're seeing emissions continuing to rise, and that's something that I'm really bringing out in my response here, because it's of real concern to people in the sector, people that want to have a long-term sustainable career in aviation, whether that's in manufacturing, airlines, working in airports, that we have an industry that is sustainable into the future in terms of continuous employment and continuous flying. And we can't do that if we blow our budget within the next 10 years. We might have to stop flying completely, to be extreme. He makes that point himself here. This is the leading chief executive of the leading engineering company in the UK, and I couldn't have put it better myself. So I'd agree with him. We need to, as soon as possible, make sure that carbon emissions are reducing and make sure that we can extend that carbon budget as long as possible. There's a lot of other things in the document, but it's going over the same ground that we've gone over in the Jet Zero consultation.
I might come back to that, but I'll move on to some other questions that you were asked. So it was put to you that you don't come as an independent witness. You come with a particular view, and you said, yes, that's the position with every witness. But I wanted to delve into that a bit more. In the evidence that you've compiled on all the topics that we've discussed, to what extent have you relied on peer-reviewed scientific papers and documents and evidence?
I think every single opinion and piece of text I've put in my evidence is supported by a reference, a lot of scientific articles, a lot of industry documents, whether that's from specific companies or from the industry bodies, be that ICAO, IATA, and leading scientific journals. So I'm pretty confident everything in there is backed up by science and by clear logic and engineering and physics.
Then it was put to you that you are seeking to change government policies in the work that you are doing with your social media-based organization. And you agreed that you're seeking to change government policies. To what extent are you asking these inspectors to change government policies in this inquiry?
I'm not.
And to what extent are you using this inquiry as a vehicle to achieve change of government policy?
I'm not.
You said the CCC's pathways, it was put to you that you talk about the CCC's pathways being optimistic on a number of levels, and there was backwards and forwards about that. To what extent are you asking the inspectors not to apply the CCC's pathways?
I'm not. The only thing I'd point out is that it's likely we will need to go further, faster than the CCC's pathways because of optimistic assumptions themselves within the CCC's projections.
Then you had an interesting exchange with my learned friend about the CCCAP, and we've taken everything that you've said about that as read, but I think this is a slightly new point that came out as a result of the exchange. Because you were talking about the knock-on effect of some of the abatement measures in the CCCAP, so Bristol's CCAP, being put into place, and you were talking about the knock-on effect more broadly from that. Can you just expand on that, please?
I'm not sure specifically which statement.
I don't think I did ask about the CCCAP. I certainly didn't mean to. If there was misunderstanding between us, I apologise.
You did mention the CCCAP. I can't remember in what context. It might have been zero-emissions aircraft. You definitely mentioned it.
Did I? Okay, maybe I did mention it. I think you did. So be it.
Yeah. So the exchange was about let me try and get the exact exchange. Yes, so it was in the context, it became the discussion about a tiny fraction of 1% of what is required to get to net zero. So the extra emissions from the airport being a tiny fraction of 1% of what's required to get to net zero in 2050. And if the test is one of whether it's going to make a material difference, the answer plainly is no. And you said the answer clearly is yes, because the abatement measures that are going to be relied on will put costs up across the rest of the economy. And then there was,
that was only one reason, and I didn't really get into other. I mean, I've laid out quite clearly in section 3 of my proof of evidence why it's not a small fraction. Kevin Anderson dealt with that very well this morning as well.
Yes, I'm not asking you about that bit. Okay. I'm asking you about the kind of costs implications that you were talking about, that rebound across the whole economy, which was essentially what you were saying.
Yes.
Okay, so if you could focus on that. Maybe you don't want to say anything else.
Well, I think
I
think I just go back to what I said, whereas I am not the expert on this, but this is how it is perceived to me. I think the one policy mechanism that we have for trying to reduce demand would be ineffective, and it would also raise the costs across the rest of the economy as well, which would have significant consequences that you need to consider. I'm not going to speak from a point of expertise on that, but I wanted to make that point.
Okay, final point, unless I come back to INQ, so give me one sec. But the final point was you had a discussion with my learned friend about the language that was put to you. So it was put to you that the government has not indicated that capacity caps in relation to airports is an appropriate response. And you picked up the word appropriate, and there was some disagreement between you. I'd like you to go in your in your supplementary proof of evidence, so your W2/5 proof of evidence,
Yes.
to page 28. Your paragraph 4.28.
.28, yes.
Because you extract there what the Jet Zero consultation actually says. Even if the sector returns to a pre-COVID demand trajectory, as we have assumed in our analysis, we currently believe the sector can achieve Jet Zero without the government needing to intervene directly to limit aviation growth. So
Yes.
in light of your discussion with my learned friend about his choice of the word an appropriate response, what would you like to say given what Jet Zero says?
Well, I think it would be an appropriate response, and I think that response is available at a local level for us to make without the government, or not for us.
And does this quote from Jet Zero tell us anything about what the government might think is an appropriate response in future, given what it says is we currently believe the sector can achieve? Does it tell us anything about appropriateness going forward?
No, it does not, and it's also just a consultation, so I don't think we could put much weight on that. But it's, I firmly believe that there is no other way. So I also expect that to be the future position, and as they say, currently believe, so they may well change their minds.
Then finally, the bit in INQ 59 to which my attention has been drawn is page 17.
This was the Rolls-Royce.
Yes, this is the Rolls-Royce document, so we're going to finish with Rolls-Royce, I suppose where we started, really. And it talks about, on the left-hand side of that page, challenges to consider, including emissions from sole product supply chains, etc. And then on the facing page, on the right-hand side of the page, 3 lines up from the bottom, there's a quote that's given there. Such forward-looking statements are based on numerous assumptions regarding the company's present and future business strategies and the environment in which the company will operate in the future. Certain forward-looking statements are based on assumptions of future events, which may not prove to be accurate. The forward-looking statements in this report speak only as at the date of the report. What, if anything, do you want to say about that?
Well, that's the standard legal wording that's applied to corporate forecasts. So they don't want to. There's no enforceable commitment behind the pathways they're laying out. They can't be held account legally if they fail to deliver what's in some of their projections.
So thank you very much indeed, and thanks to everybody who needed an indulgence for the room for 4:30. I'm very grateful.
Okay, thanks very much. We're finished for today. Obviously, resume 9:30. Could I ask everybody to pack up and move out of the room as swiftly as possible so that the council staff can do their jobs? 9:30 tomorrow then.